Didn't think I was ever gonna wear this shirt again. It's been a couple of years. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today I'm talking about album number 3 from Squarepusher, Music is Rotted One Note. I think it's been well established by now, given how I've talked about Squarepusher in the past, that he's one of my favorite artists in all of electronic music. Feed Me Weird Things and Hard Normal Daddy are two of my favorite albums in the guy's whole catalog, and the latter is my favorite out of him, period. But if this guy's catalog had more stuff that sounded just like those first two albums, I doubt I'd hold him in quite such a high regard. Not because I don't like those first two albums, obviously we know what I think of those, but is because I don't like formula abusers. I like artists who reinvent themselves and try new things and keep trying to stay fresh. Because even when an experiment fails, I'll always give credit to an artist for taking a risk. I mean, I suppose I wouldn't necessarily mind it if Squarepusher kept making stuff like Hard Normal Daddy, but I think that would get boring eventually. I much prefer the universe we live in where he instead releases something like Music is Rotted One Note. An album that doesn't contain any sequencers or samplers, everything is played by real instruments by the man himself. That includes not just bass, but also drums and keyboards and everything else. And the album isn't all that electronic, really. Instead, Jenkinson has decided to try his hands on experimental jazz fusion in the style of Miles Davis. Think albums like Bitches Brew, In a Silent Way, and On the Corner. It's a weird album that a lot of people were put off by, to say the very least. But it's the jazz elements that first drew me to Squarepusher in the first place. Being a bit of a jazz fan on the side, I figured this was gonna be no problem for me. I like Miles Davis, I like Herbie Hancock, and this certainly is not a problem for me, but maybe I was a little put off initially as well. And the main reason for that is actually, ironically, the electronic elements of the album, which pushed so far into experimental territory that it was a bit of a rough listen for me at first. Like, there are synthesizers on this album from what I can tell, but they're so much more free-flowing and abstract and atonal than I thought they were going to be. There are stretches of this album that basically have no melody at all, instead opting for creepy and unsettling noise, all the way through to the end. It's obvious that Jenkinson went into this with hopes of challenging the listener and subverting their expectations, and subvert them he very much did. But regardless, I kept trying with this album, figuring there had to be something more in the album for me to get into, and fast forward to now, like 4-ish years later, and it's now one of my favorite albums of all time. I do still prefer Hard Normal Daddy, of course, being a lot easier for me to get into, but of course, being the jazz lover I am and having warmed up a little more to the weirder side of Miles Davis than back when I first heard this, I'm into it a lot more. There's definitely something appealing about even the weirdest and darkest corners of this album. Just an overarching smoothness that makes this album designed to make the listener uncomfortable, ending up feeling weirdly relaxing and satisfying, especially as of late. Now, of course, I will warn you that it has taken me several years to get to this point. It's definitely not the kind of album that I can see someone coming into it for the first time being super into all the way through. It's the kind of album that needs the time to properly grow on you, I think. Well, hopefully this video can prepare you for what you'd be getting into in the case you haven't heard it yet. So first and foremost, it's not like this album is all experimental weirdness all the time. In fact, the first couple of tracks are actually quite musical, like Chunk S. It's kind of a funkier track with, of course, a really nice bass line. Even though it starts with a bunch of muted recording demos and mumbling. Bitches Brew had mumbling on it too, though. Don't Go Plastic, meanwhile, is where the album really starts to get into gear. It's a track that just kind of flows all over the place with lots of dissonant and sour jazz melodies flying around, yet there is something oddly striking about it. That first chord progression at the beginning, despite how sour it sounds, is weirdly catchy. And the track only continues to get more fun and interesting after that. Starting to get a little dark out, isn't it? Dust Switch, meanwhile, is on the more laid-back side, with melodies moving a lot more slowly, though the drums are just as freeform and space-filling as basically everything else on here. It isn't until Curve 1 that we start to fall into the weird experimental rabbit hole. That track is just a sea of atonal and alien synth effects made to resemble the old days of musique concrète. Like, we're talking really old stuff here, like even pre-Kraftwerk and Tangerine Dream. Like, we're talking 1940s-ish, with people like Edgar Varese, just random electronic noise that doesn't really fall on any tone and doesn't sound like it came from this earth. That's the kind of stuff these weird experimental tracks are emulating. Same with the track Parallelogram Bin, which I initially went into hoping for something along the lines of Boards of Canada, but it is not that. Now, these two tracks are basically just interludes more than anything, though. Like, there is a track in between the two called 137 Rinse, which is somewhere in between the more musical jazz stuff on this album and the weird alien stuff. There's some kind of interesting filter on there's some kind of interesting reverby filter on some of these sounds that make it sound particularly strange, but surprisingly pretty nice. Can get particularly ghostly in areas. And we do return to the more grounded sounds from earlier in the album on Circular Flexing, at least besides the creepy talkbox thing placed over the track to make it more unnerving. Like, the melodies on a lot of these tracks are really mysterious sounding, but not so out of this world that I can't connect with them. Even on my earlier listens of this thing, I still liked these more melodic sections. Ill Descent is another good example of this. The old school synth effects are really starting to go into those old 60s Miles Davis type of sounds. Everything sounds like it's falling down this psychedelic pit. But there's still a jazzy chord progression running through everything to prevent it from getting too inaccessible. And thankfully right after that you get easily the most normal sounding track on the album, My Sound. Kind of a contemplative and nostalgic sounding piece that's on the slower side. Nothing too weird, all the electric pianos and soft guitars make for quite the relaxing album centerpiece. And after another interlude called Drunken Style, which lives up to its name but doesn't stick out much otherwise, we finally get Theme from Vertical Hold, one last jazzier piece with an off-kilter pulse that seems to change every couple of seconds. But after this, all bets are basically off. The remaining 4 tracks on this album fall completely into that experimental rabbit hole. Ruin brings in some horrifying noise, guitar feedback seeming to imitate someone screaming, and ghostly and empty sounding pads in the background similarly dissonant to really show you shit is getting real. Shin Triad attempts to return to the more normal jazz sound from earlier by bringing in the electric Rhodes pianos again, but to no avail as the percussion and noise underneath is too chaotic and completely formless. Then we get one more creepy alien interlude with Step 1, and finally end with Last Approach, which basically sounds like one big drum beat moving too slow to form a pulse, layered over what sounds like an air raid siren. And aside from some subtle effects here and there, that's really all there is to that track. Basically ending the album with the creepiest and least accessible track in the whole bunch. That's certainly one way to go out. This track was actually the main reason I wasn't keen on the album at first, because not very much happens in it. It is just kind of like laying on the ground waiting for your LSD to wear off or something. I mean, I don't take drugs, I don't know what the experience is like, but this does feel like it's trying to simulate a bad trip or something. I kind of have some weird respect for it now, though. Just such a ballsy move to end on something like that. And yet, it feels right somehow, too. It's hard to explain. It's certainly not one of my personal favorite tracks in the bunch, but I certainly appreciate it in the context of the album and don't skip over it, even though I so easily could, being the last track and all. I mean, it really feels wrong for me to skip any tracks on this album, because one of the main things about this album as a whole is that it really flows together pretty seamlessly. And it's not just tracks literally mixing with each other continuously. It's just an album that seems to work best when played from front to back, helping really set up that creepy LSD trip atmosphere combined with that old Miles Davis experimental jazz sound. Despite all the weirdness and creepiness contained within, and the fact that there are plenty of noise tracks that do occasionally border on the harsher side, especially near the end, the entire thing as a whole is constructed so smoothly and the sounds are so strangely enticing that I've basically been wholeheartedly won over by all of it. It's a weird album, but also a pretty relaxing one for me personally as well. I just do love all the mysterious jazzy melodies and the reverby drums and the watery alien effects and everything. I will admit it's probably not going to be the kind of album that everyone's going to enjoy, but I'm still going to highly recommend it regardless. I will completely understand if you come out of it not liking it and wishing for the days of the fast-paced breakbeats and IDM that covered his previous work, but it's still such a strange and unique album that it really should be experienced regardless. Sometimes when we step out of our comfort zone a little, we might end up finding something that works really well, so I'm overall feeling an 8.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I did that wrong, didn't I? That's all for today. See you next time. By the way, I forgot the CD. I have the CD as well. That's cool, right? You should get the CD too, I think.